The great doors of the ceremony hall had just been sealed shut, and the moment they locked, Lyra Ashworth felt her heart slam against her ribs, like a fist against a door that would not open. Hundreds of wolves filled the hall, packed shoulder to shoulder, all of them dressed in their finest cloaks, all of them waiting for the same thing. On the raised platform at the front of the room stood Alpha King Kalen Voss, tall and still, his hand resting on a scroll that would end 50 years of war between the northern and southern packs. The ink on that scroll was not yet dry. In a few seconds, it would be permanent. Lyra had not planned to speak. She told herself that 100 times, as she stood near the back wall, pressed between two broad-shouldered guards who smelled of pine smoke and steel. She had come only to watch, only to be present for a moment that every wolf in the kingdom would remember for the rest of their lives. But then Kalen lifted the ceremonial pen, and something inside her chest twisted so violently that she gasped out loud. It was not fear. Lyra knew fear well, and this was not it. This was the same cold, certain feeling she had felt only a handful of times before in her life, a feeling that arrived without warning, and never once had been wrong. It came now, rising from her stomach into her throat, and it carried with it a single, undeniable truth. The treaty was a lie. She did not know which part of it was false. She did not know who had written the lie into the ink, or why, or what it would cost the kingdom to sign it. She only knew, with the same certainty she knew her own name, that if Kalen Voss pressed that pen to the parchment, he would be sealing his people to a promise that was never real. "Wait," she said. Her voice was not loud. It should not have carried over the hum of hundreds of wolves breathing and shifting and waiting. But something about the way she said it, some crack of desperation underneath the single word, cut through the noise like a blade through cloth. Heads turned. The hum died. By the time the silence reached the front of the hall, every eye in the room had found her. Kalen lowered the pen, an inch above the parchment, and looked up. Lyra had never stood this close to a king before. She had seen him from a distance during festivals, a tall shape on a high balcony, a voice carried by wind. Up close, even across the length of the hall, he looked younger than she expected, and more tired. There were shadows beneath his eyes that no amount of royal tailoring could hide. For a moment, he only stared at her, as if trying to understand why a stranger in the back of the room had just interrupted the most important moment of his reign. Who spoke? His voice filled the hall without effort, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. Lyra's legs felt like water beneath her, but she stepped forward anyway, past the guards, into the aisle that split the crowd in two. Every step felt like walking across a frozen lake that might crack beneath her at any moment. When she finally stopped, she was close enough to see the fine stitching on the king's dark blue coat, close enough to see Draven Cole, standing just behind his shoulder, his jaw tightening the moment she came into view. "My name is Lyra Ashworth," she said, "and that treaty is not what it says it is." A wave of gasps rolled through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. Somewhere near the front, an older wolf muttered a word that might have been a curse. Draven's eyes narrowed, but his face remained otherwise calm, too calm, the kind of calm a person wears when they are working very hard not to show anything at all. "That is a serious accusation," Kalen said slowly. "Do you have proof?" This was the question Lyra had dreaded since the word had left her mouth. She had no papers, no witness, no confession, nothing that a court or a council would ever accept as evidence. All she had was a feeling that lived somewhere beneath her ribs, a gift, passed down from her mother and her mother's mother, a strange and lonely inheritance that most of the kingdom dismissed as superstition or madness. "No," she admitted, "I have no proof. Not yet." Laughter broke out near the front, sharp and mocking, and Lyra felt her face burn. Draven leaned toward the king and murmured something too quiet for her to hear, but she could guess the shape of it well enough. Remove her. Silence her. Let the ceremony continue. She braced herself for the guards to step forward, for hands to close around her arms and drag her from the hall in front of everyone she had ever known. Instead, Kalen raised a hand, and the hall fell silent again. "If you have no proof," he said, his gaze steady on hers, "then why should I believe a word you say?" Lyra swallowed hard. She thought of her mother, who had died believing no one would ever listen to a woman who felt truth the way other people felt heat or cold. She thought of every time she had been laughed out of a room for saying something no one wanted to hear. She thought, too, of the strange, sick certainty twisting in her stomach even now, refusing to fade, refusing to be reasoned away. "Because I have never been wrong," she said. "Not once. Not in my whole life. Ask anyone who has known me since I was a child. I do not know how I know things, my king, only that I know them, and I am telling you, with everything I have, that if you sign that treaty today, you will be building your kingdom's future on top of a lie that will one day bring it down." The hall was utterly still. Even the guards seemed to have forgotten to breathe. Kaelin studied her for a long moment, and Lyra forced herself not to look away, though every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. "She is clearly disturbed," Draven said smoothly, stepping forward at last. "My king, we cannot allow the ceremony to be delayed by the ravings of a stranger. The northern delegation is waiting. Every moment we hesitate is an insult to their patience." For the first time since she had spoken, Lyra saw something flicker across Kaelin's face, something that was not quite doubt, but was not quite dismissal either. His eyes moved from her to Draven and back again, as if weighing two very different kinds of truth against each other. "The northern delegation has waited 50 years, Kaelin said finally. "They can wait a few more minutes." He set the pen down on the small table beside the parchment, and the sound of it, a single soft click against polished wood, seemed to echo through the entire hall. Draven's jaw tightened again, just slightly, just enough that Lyra caught it. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing most people in the room would never have noticed. But Lyra was not most people. She had spent her whole life noticing the small things that gave lies away. The flicker of an eye, the tightening of a jaw, the half-second of silence before a person answered too quickly. And in that moment, watching Draven Cole's carefully composed face crack just slightly at the edges, the cold certainty in her stomach grew even colder. "Clear the hall," Kaelin said. "The ceremony will resume once I have spoken with this woman privately." The order sent a ripple of confusion and murmuring through the crowd, but no one dared question it aloud. Guards began ushering wolves toward the doors, and Lyra found herself standing alone, in the wide, echoing hall, as it slowly emptied around her, until only Kaelin, Draven, a handful of guards, and herself remained. Draven did not leave easily. "My king, this is unwise. She could be an agent of the Northern Pax, sent to disrupt the treaty at its final hour. I would advise." "I did not ask for your advice," Kaelin said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that closed the conversation. "Wait outside with the others, Draven. I will call for you when I am ready." For a moment, Draven looked as though he might argue further. Then he inclined his head, a gesture that was technically respectful, but carried an edge of something colder beneath it, and turned to walk toward the doors. As he passed Lyra, he paused just long enough to speak to her alone, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it. "Be very careful, little seer," he murmured. "Kings who listen to voices without proof rarely stay kings for long. And people who make accusations they cannot prove rarely stay safe." Then he was gone, the doors closing behind him, with a heavy, final sound, and Lyra was left standing in the vast, empty hall, with the one man in the kingdom, whose future she had just tried to change. Kaelin studied her in silence for a long moment before he spoke again. "You understand what you have done," he said. "You have delayed a treaty that ends a war, which has killed thousands of wolves on both sides. If you are wrong, I will have no choice but to punish you as an example, for the sake of peace." "I understand," Lyra said quietly. "And if you are right?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than anything Draven had said. Lyra realized, with a small jolt of surprise, that Kaelin was not mocking her. He was genuinely asking. Somewhere beneath the exhaustion in his eyes, there was a flicker of something that looked almost like hope, as if some small part of him had been waiting his whole reign for someone to tell him the truth he was too afraid to look for himself. "If I am right," she said, "then someone very close to you has been lying to your face for a very long time, and you deserve to know who." Kaelin's gaze moved briefly toward the doors Draven had disappeared through, and something in his expression shifted, though he said nothing to confirm what she suspected he was already thinking. Instead, he walked slowly toward her, stopping only a few paces away, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold hidden in his dark eyes. "Tell me about this gift of yours," he said, "the one that has never been wrong." Lyra took a steadying breath. She had spent her whole life hiding this part of herself, softening it, apologizing for it, pretending it was nothing more than a strange kind of intuition that people found unsettling. She had never once, in 23 years of life, been asked to explain it plainly to someone who seemed to actually want to understand. "It is not magic. Not exactly," she began. "My mother had it. Her mother had it before her. When someone speaks a lie in front of me, truly speaks it, believing it to be false, even as the words leave their mouth, I feel it. Here." She pressed a hand lightly against her stomach. "It feels like something twisting, something cold. I cannot always tell what the lie is about. I only know, with absolute certainty, that a lie has been spoken." "And you felt this when I lifted the pen," Kaelin said. "No," Lyra admitted. "I felt it before that, the moment the treaty was brought into the hall, before a single word was spoken over it. I felt it so strongly I nearly fell to my knees. Whatever is false in that document, my king, it was written into it long before today." Kaelin was quiet for a long time after that, turning slowly to look at the parchment still resting on the small table where he had set down the pen. The candlelight caught the edges of the ink, and for the first time, Lyra saw something new pass across his face. Not doubt about her, but doubt about the very document he had been about to sign in front of his entire kingdom. "Draven drafted the final terms of this treaty," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "He has been my most trusted commander since I took the throne. He fought beside my father. He has never given me reason to question his loyalty." "I am not asking you to condemn him," Lyra said carefully. "I am asking you to look closer before you sign something that cannot be unsigned." Kaelin turned back to face her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the hall, Lyra could hear the low murmur of the crowd waiting in the courtyard. Hundreds of wolves who had traveled for days to witness the end of a war, unaware that the man who was supposed to end it now stood frozen in the empty hall, staring at a stranger who claimed to feel the shape of lies the way other people felt the wind. "If I delay the ceremony to investigate your claim," Kaelin said finally, "and you are wrong, it will not only cost you your freedom, it could cost this kingdom the peace it has waited 50 years for. Do you understand what you are asking of me?" "I do," Lyra said, and her voice did not waver, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her cloak, were trembling. "And I am telling you, my king, that I would rather lose everything I have than watch you sign your people into a lie without at least trying to stop it." Something in her words seemed to settle something in him. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that felt as though he were trying to see straight through her skin, to whatever truth lived underneath. And then, slowly, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "The ceremony will be postponed. Officially, it will be announced as a delay for further negotiation with the northern delegation. Unofficially," he paused, glancing once more toward the closed doors Draven had passed through, "you and I are going to find out exactly what has been hidden inside that treaty, and who hid it there." Relief flooded through Lyra so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled beneath her. But beneath the relief, the cold certainty in her stomach had not faded. If anything, it had grown sharper, colder, more insistent, as though some part of her already understood that the truth waiting to be uncovered was far darker than either of them yet realized. "Thank you," she whispered. "Do not thank me yet," Kaelin said, and for the first time, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though his eyes remained serious. "If you are wrong about this, Lyra Ashworth, you will have made an enemy of every wolf in this kingdom who wanted peace today. And if you are right, you may have just made an enemy far more dangerous than any of them." Outside the hall, the crowd was still waiting, restless and confused, and somewhere among them, Draven Cole stood watching the closed doors with an expression that no one else thought to question. But Lyra, even from a distance, through solid wood and stone, could feel it. That same cold twist in her stomach, sharper now than ever before, warning her that the lie she had sensed was only the beginning of something far larger and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The private study Kaelin led her to was smaller than Lyra expected a king's chamber to be, lined floor to ceiling with old books and maps, lit by a single fire crackling low in the hearth. He closed the heavy door behind them and turned the lock, and the small click of the latch felt louder than it should have in the quiet room. "No one enters here without my permission," he said, gesturing for her to sit in one of two worn leather chairs facing the fire. Not even Draven. Whatever we discuss stays within these walls until we decide otherwise. Lyra sat carefully, still half expecting the whole day to dissolve like smoke, for guards to burst through the door and drag her away for the disruption she had caused. But Kalen settled into the chair across from her, resting his elbows on his knees, and studied her with the same unreadable focus he had shown in the hall. "Tell me everything you know," he said. "Not what you feel, what you know." "I told you already, my king. I do not know facts. I know only that something is false." "Then tell me what you noticed today. Every small thing. Sometimes the smallest details matter more than we realize." Lyra thought back over the ceremony, forcing herself to move past the overwhelming wave of certainty that had gripped her, and focus instead on the details surrounding it. The moment the treaty was carried into the hall, she said slowly, before anyone spoke a single word, "I felt it. That is unusual. Normally the feeling comes only when someone actually speaks a lie aloud in front of me. To feel it from a document itself means the lie is not something spoken casually. It was written deliberately, and carried into that hall knowing exactly what it was." Kalen nodded slowly, absorbing this. "And Draven? When he spoke to me privately, after you sent him away, he warned me to be careful. He said kings who listen to voices without proof rarely stay kings for long." Lyra hesitated. It was not what he said that troubled me. It was that when he said it, I felt nothing. No twist, no cold feeling. He believed every word of the threat completely. "That is not surprising," Kalen said. "Draven is loyal to the throne, even if his methods are sometimes harsh. It would not surprise me if he genuinely believed a threat was necessary to protect the peace." "Perhaps," Lyra allowed, "but loyalty to the throne is not the same as loyalty to the truth, my king. A man can love his king with his whole heart, and still bury something dangerous beneath the floor of a treaty, believing he is protecting everyone by doing so." Kalen fell silent, staring into the fire as though searching for something in the shifting light of the flames. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, more thoughtful than commanding. "This treaty was not written overnight. It took 3 years to negotiate. Draven led every session on my behalf, because I was young when the talks began, barely more than a boy wearing my father's crown, and I trusted him to guide me through waters I did not yet understand. If there is a lie buried inside those years of negotiation, it will not be easy to find." "Then we start with what we can find," Lyra said. "Records, witnesses, anyone who was present during those years, who might remember something that never made it into the final document." "There is a woman," Kalen said slowly, as though the memory were surfacing from somewhere deep and half-forgotten. "Her name is Nora. She served as a scribe during the earliest negotiations, before Draven took full control of the process. She retired from court service years ago, but she still lives within the city walls, if I recall correctly. If anyone kept records outside of what was officially submitted, it would be her." "Then we should speak with her," Lyra said, feeling the first small flicker of hope she had allowed herself since stepping into the hall that morning. Kalen studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You understand that if we do this, and Draven learns of it before we have proof, he will not simply threaten you again. He commands half the guard within these walls. If he believes you to be a genuine danger to the treaty, to his position, he will not hesitate to remove that danger by whatever means necessary." "I understand the risk," Lyra said, and though her voice remained steady, she felt the weight of his warning settle over her like a heavy cloak. "But I would rather face that risk than live the rest of my life knowing I said nothing, while a kingdom was built on a lie I could have stopped." Something shifted in Kalen's expression then, something that looked almost like respect, though he said nothing to name it. Instead, he rose from his chair and crossed to a small desk in the corner of the room, retrieving a plain gray cloak from where it hung on a hook nearby. "We will go tonight," he said, quietly, without guards, without announcement. "If Draven learns the king himself is investigating Nora's memory of the negotiations, it will raise questions we are not yet ready to answer." "You would leave the palace without your guards?" Lyra asked, surprised. "I have done it before," Kalen said, a faint, tired smile touching his mouth. "Being king does not mean I have forgotten how to move quietly when I need to. Besides, 2 strangers slipping through the streets after dark will draw far less attention than a king's procession." They left through a servant's passage hidden behind a bookshelf, One Kalen clearly knew well from years of using it to escape the suffocating formality of court life. The passage led them out through a small door near the palace kitchens, into the cool night air of the city beyond the walls. Lyra had never walked beside a king before, had certainly never expected to do so wrapped in a borrowed gray cloak, weaving through narrow streets, lit by lantern light, while the man beside her kept his hood low over his face. The city at night felt like an entirely different world from the grand ceremony hall she had stood in only hours earlier, alive with the sounds of taverns and distant laughter, the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat drifting from open windows. "Do you often walk among your people like this?" she asked quietly, as they moved through a quieter street lined with modest homes. "Less than I should," Kalen admitted. "There is a difference between ruling a kingdom from a throne and understanding the people who live within it. My father used to say, a king who never walks his own streets forgets, eventually, what he is ruling for." He paused at a narrow doorway set between two shops, its wood weathered gray by years of wind and rain. "This is the place." He knocked 3 times, waited, then knocked twice more, a pattern that suggested he had used this exact signal before. A long moment passed before the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight braid, her sharp eyes narrowing suspiciously at the 2 hooded figures on her doorstep. "It has been years since anyone from the palace bothered to knock on my door," she said, her voice rough with age but steady. Then her gaze settled on Kalen's face beneath the shadow of his hood, and something shifted in her expression, recognition mixed with wariness. "My king, I did not expect to see you here, and certainly not dressed like a common traveler." "May we come in, Nora?" Kalen asked. "It is important, and I would rather not discuss it where anyone passing might overhear." Nora hesitated only a moment before stepping aside to let them enter. Her small home was cluttered, but clean, shelves crowded with old books and carefully labeled jars, a single candle burning on a table near the window. She gestured for them to sit, then lowered herself into a chair across from them, with the careful movements of someone whose joints had grown stiff with age. "I imagine this visit has something to do with the treaty," she said, before either of them could speak. "Word travels fast, even to an old woman who no longer sets foot in the palace. They say the ceremony was delayed today, that some stranger interrupted the signing with an accusation no one could explain." "That stranger is sitting beside me," Kalen said. "Her name is Lyra Ashworth, and she believes the treaty contains a lie, though she cannot yet say what it is or where it hides. I am hoping you might remember something from the early negotiations that could help us find it." Nora's sharp eyes turned toward Lyra, studying her with an intensity that made Lyra feel as though the older woman were peering straight through her, searching for something honest or false in her face. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because after a long moment, she sighed and leaned back in her chair. "I served as a scribe for the first 2 years of those negotiations," she said, "before Commander Draven took full control of the proceedings and brought in his own people to handle the records. I remember those early years well, and I remember something that troubled me even then, though I never had proof enough to speak of it, and no one would have listened to an old scribe over a war commander in any case." "What did you see?" Lyra asked, leaning forward. "There was a clause," Nora said slowly, as though pulling the memory up from somewhere deep and long buried. "Early in the negotiations, before Draven took over, the northern delegation insisted on a condition regarding the border territories, a condition meant to protect the smaller wolf villages scattered along the disputed lands from being absorbed entirely into either kingdom's control. It was meant to give those villages a voice, a say in their own governance, regardless of which side of the border they fell upon. That clause is not in the final treaty," Kalen said quietly. "I have read every line of it more times than I can count. There is no mention of village governance anywhere within it." "No," Nora agreed, "because somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd year of negotiations, after Draven took control, that clause disappeared entirely, replaced instead with language granting broad administrative control over the border territories, to whichever commander oversaw the treaty's enforcement. I remember reading the final draft when it was first circulated among the court scribes, and I remember thinking it strange that such an important protection had simply vanished, without any record of it being formally withdrawn or renegotiated." Lyra felt the cold certainty in her stomach twist sharply, confirming what Nora had just described, with an intensity that left her briefly breathless. "That is it," she said. That is the lie. Whoever wrote the final draft made it appear as though that protection had never existed at all. Draven oversees the treaty's enforcement, Kalen said slowly, the weight of the realization settling visibly across his face. If that clause was removed and replaced with language granting administrative control to whoever enforces the treaty, then Draven himself would inherit authority over the entire border territory, authority the original negotiators never intended to give him. Or worse, Nora said quietly. Authority he perhaps arranged to give himself, long before the final signing ever took place. The three of them sat in silence for a long moment, the small candle flickering on the table between them, the weight of what they had just uncovered settling heavily over the room. Lyra glanced at Kalen and saw something hardening behind his eyes, something that looked less like doubt now, and more like the beginning of quiet, controlled fury. I need proof, he said finally, not memory, not suspicion. If I am to confront Draven with this, I will need something no one can dismiss as the fading recollection of an old woman or the unproven instincts of a stranger. There may be a way, Nora said slowly. The original draft, the one containing the village governance clause, was never formally destroyed, only replaced within the official archive. Records of that kind, especially ones considered outdated or superseded, are often moved to the lower archive beneath the palace rather than burned. If it still exists anywhere, it would be there. The lower archive is guarded, Kalen said. Draven's own men oversee access to it. Then you will need to find a reason to enter that. Even Draven's men cannot refuse, Nora said. Or a way inside that does not require their permission at all. Lyra felt the weight of what lay ahead settle over her, heavier now than the accusation she had made in the ceremony hall that morning. Finding the courage to speak a truth she could not prove had been difficult enough. What waited for them now, buried somewhere beneath the palace in a guarded archive controlled by the very man they suspected of betrayal, would require far more than courage alone. Then that is where we go next, Kalen said, rising from his chair, his voice quiet but resolute. Tonight, if it can be managed. The longer that proof remains buried, the more time Draven has to notice we are looking for it. Nora reached out and caught Lyra's hand as she rose to follow Kalen toward the door, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so aged. Be careful, child, she said quietly, her sharp eyes softening with something that looked almost like sympathy. Gifts like yours have always been dangerous to carry, in a world that prefers comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Whatever you find beneath that palace, do not let it cost you more than you are willing to lose. Lyra squeezed the old woman's hand gently before releasing it, though she could not bring herself to offer any promise in return. Some part of her, the same part that had felt the cold twist of certainty the moment the treaty was carried into the ceremony hall, already understood that the path ahead would demand more from her than she had ever been asked to give. Outside, the night had grown colder, the streets emptier, the distant sounds of the city fading into a heavy, watchful silence. As they made their way back toward the palace, Lyra could not shake the feeling that somewhere within those walls, Draven Cole was already beginning to wonder why the king had disappeared so quietly into the night, and what exactly he might be searching for in the dark. The lower archive beneath the palace could only be reached through a narrow stone stairwell hidden behind a locked storage room, and Kalen carried a key on a chain beneath his shirt that he had never once needed to use since the day his father died. His hands were steady as he unlocked the storage room door, but Lyra could feel the tension radiating from him as they slipped inside and pulled the door closed behind them. If we are found down here without explanation, he said quietly as they descended the cold stone steps, even my own guards may report it to Draven before they report it to me. His influence runs deeper than I realized until today. Then we will simply have to make certain we are not found, Lyra said, though her own heart was pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. The archive itself was a vast, dim room, lined with shelves stretching far back into shadow, thousands of scrolls and bound records stacked in careful rows, each section marked with faded labels denoting years and subjects long forgotten by anyone but the palace's oldest scribes. A single lantern hung near the entrance, and Kalen lit it carefully, casting a small circle of warm light against the overwhelming darkness surrounding them. Nora said the original draft would have been filed as superseded, Kalen murmured, moving toward a section of shelves marked with a symbol Lyra did not recognize. Records considered outdated are kept separate from active documents, organized by the year they were replaced rather than the year they were written. They searched in near silence for what felt like hours, the only sounds the soft rustle of parchment and the occasional creak of old wooden shelves settling under their own weight. Lyra's fingers grew dusty, and her eyes ached from squinting at faded ink in the dim lantern light. But the cold certainty in her stomach had not faded, urging her forward, insisting that whatever they were searching for was close, closer than either of them yet realized. "Here," Kalen said suddenly, his voice tight with restrained excitement. He pulled a thick, aged scroll from a shelf marked with a year Lyra recognized as falling near the beginning of the treaty negotiations. Carefully, he unrolled it across a nearby table, and Lyra leaned in close beside him, both of them studying the faded handwriting by lantern light. It took only a few lines for Lyra to feel the truth of it settle over her like a physical weight. There, written plainly in the careful hand of a scribe who had no reason to lie, was the missing clause Nora had described, granting the border villages the right to govern themselves regardless of which kingdom claimed the surrounding territory. Beside it, in a different hand, someone had scrawled a brief note in the margin, one that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. Superseded by revised terms, authorized by Commander Draven Cole, in the interest of unified border enforcement. Kalen read aloud, his voice low and hard. There is no mention of the northern delegation agreeing to this change, no signature from their representatives at all. Because they never agreed to it, Lyra said quietly. This was never renegotiated. It was simply removed and replaced, and the final treaty was written to make it appear as though the change had always been part of the agreement. Kalen stared down at the old scroll for a long moment, his jaw tight, his knuckles white where his hands gripped the edge of the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous beneath the calm surface of it, something Lyra had not heard from him before. "He has been governing behind my back for years," he said. "Every decision made regarding the border territories since the treaty was finalized, decisions I believed were made under my authority, were made under authority he granted himself, hidden inside language I trusted him to write honestly." "We have the proof now," Lyra said. "You can confront him." "No," Kalen said sharply, and when he looked up at her, there was a warning in his eyes that made her go still. "Not yet. If I confront him with this alone, he will simply claim the original clause was renegotiated verbally, that the northern delegation agreed to the change even without a written signature, and there will be no way to prove otherwise. Draven is many things, but he is not careless. If this scroll is truly proof of what I now believe him capable of, he will have prepared some explanation for it long before tonight." Lyra felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cold stone walls surrounding them. "Then what do we do?" "We find out how deep this goes," Kalen said, carefully rolling the scroll closed and tucking it beneath his cloak. "If Draven altered this treaty for his own benefit, it is unlikely this is the only lie he has buried. I need to understand the full shape of what he has built before I confront him, or he will simply find a way to bury the truth again." They made their way back up through the narrow stairwell, the stolen scroll hidden carefully against Kalen's chest, and slipped back into the storage room, just as the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the high windows above the palace kitchens. Lyra's whole body ached with exhaustion, but her mind remained sharp, turning over everything they had discovered, searching for the shape of a conspiracy far larger than a single altered clause in an old treaty. They had barely made it back into the servants' passage when a familiar voice stopped them both cold. "You are up rather early, my king," Draven said, stepping out from a side corridor with an expression that gave nothing away. His eyes moved briefly toward Lyra, then back to Kalen, and something in his gaze made Lyra's stomach twist violently, though she could not tell whether it was suspicion or genuine curiosity behind his calm expression. "Or perhaps you never went to sleep at all." "I could not settle after yesterday's disruption," Kalen said smoothly, his voice betraying none of the tension Lyra knew he must be feeling. "I thought a walk might clear my head before I decide how best to proceed with the treaty. And you brought the woman who caused the disruption along with you," Draven observed, his tone carefully neutral, though Lyra could feel the sharpness beneath it. "I would have thought, after yesterday, you might wish to keep some distance from her, at least until her claims have been properly investigated." "I am investigating her claims myself," Kalen said. "As king, I believe that responsibility falls to me." Draven's eyes lingered on him a moment longer than felt comfortable, and Lyra held her breath, terrified that he might notice the outline of the scroll hidden beneath Kaelin's cloak, or read the truth of their nighttime excursion, written somewhere in the exhaustion on their faces. But after a long, tense moment, Draven simply inclined his head, his expression smoothing back into practiced calm. "Of course, my king. I only wish to be of assistance. Whatever you decide is necessary." The northern delegation grows restless with each day the treaty remains unsigned. "I would hate for their patience to run out before we can resolve this matter." "Their patience will hold a little longer," Kaelin said. "Thank you for your concern, Draven. I will send for you if I require anything further." Draven bowed his head again and turned to leave, but as he passed Lyra, he paused just long enough to speak to her once more, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it. "You are a very persistent young woman," he murmured. "I wonder what it is you truly hope to gain from all of this trouble you have caused." "The truth," Lyra said quietly, holding his gaze, despite the cold fear crawling beneath her skin. "Nothing more." Something flickered behind Draven's eyes then, something sharp and calculating, that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "The truth," he repeated softly, "is rarely as simple as people like to believe." Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Lyra let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her whole body trembling with the release of tension she had been carrying since the moment Draven's voice first stopped them in the hallway. Beside her, Kaelin's expression had darkened considerably, his earlier controlled fury now edged with something that looked dangerously close to fear. "He suspects something," Kaelin said quietly, once they were alone again. "I do not know how much, but he suspects. We do not have as much time as I had hoped." "Then we move quickly," Lyra said. "Whatever else Draven has hidden, we find it before he has the chance to bury it deeper, or remove anyone who might help us uncover it." Kaelin nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the corridor Draven had disappeared down, and Lyra could see the weight of the decision settling heavily over him, the realization that the man he had trusted with his kingdom for years might now be the very person working hardest to destroy it from within. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a quiet resolve that had not been there the day before. "There is a garrison stationed along the border territories," he said. "Soldiers under Draven's direct command, tasked with enforcing the treaty's terms since its earliest provisions were finalized. If he has been governing those lands under authority he was never truly granted, someone within that garrison must know something. Someone must have questioned it, even quietly, even only among themselves. Then that is where we look next," Lyra said. "It will not be safe," Kaelin warned. "The border territories are far from the palace, far from anyone who might intervene if Draven decides we have become more of a threat than he can afford to tolerate. I have already made myself a target simply by speaking in that hall yesterday," Lyra said, and though her voice trembled slightly, her resolve remained steady beneath it. "I would rather face whatever danger waits along that border than spend the rest of my life wondering what truth I left buried, because I was too afraid to keep looking." Kaelin studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his tired eyes, respect mixed with something that looked almost like concern. "You are either the bravest person I have ever met," he said quietly, "or the most reckless. I have not yet decided which." "Perhaps I am both," Lyra said, and for the first time since the ceremony hall, she felt the ghost of a smile tug at the corner of her mouth. Kaelin's own expression softened slightly in response, though the weight of everything they had uncovered still lingered heavily behind his eyes. "We leave for the border territories within the week," he said. "Quietly, and with a story that will not raise suspicion. Until then, we say nothing further of what we found tonight. Not to anyone, not even those closest to us. If Draven has eyes and ears throughout this palace, as I now fear he does, we cannot afford a single misstep." Lyra nodded, though as she watched him tuck the stolen scroll carefully into a hidden drawer within his study, she could not shake the cold certainty still lingering in her stomach, quieter now, but no less insistent, warning her that whatever truth waited for them along the border territories, it would not be uncovered without cost. The road to the border territories cut through thick forest for the better part of 3 days, and Lyra had never traveled so far from the only village she had ever known. Kaelin had arranged their journey carefully, disguising it as a routine inspection of the garrison stationed along the border, bringing only a small handful of guards he trusted completely, men whose loyalty had been tested through years of service rather than words alone. Garrick, the captain leading their small escort, was a broad-shouldered wolf with a weathered face and eyes that missed nothing. He had served under Kaelin's father before serving Kaelin himself, and though he asked no questions about why the king had suddenly decided to inspect a garrison he had not visited in over a year, Lyra could tell from the careful way he watched the surrounding trees that he understood something unusual was happening, even if he did not know the full shape of it. On the second night, they made camp in a small clearing beside a shallow stream, and Lyra found herself sitting across the fire from Kaelin long after the others had settled into their bedrolls. The flames cast flickering shadows across his face, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked less like a king, carrying the weight of a kingdom, and more like a young man carrying burdens he had never asked for. "You have been quiet since we left the palace," she said softly. "I have been thinking," Kaelin admitted, "about how long Draven has had control over decisions that should never have been his to make. I keep returning to moments over the past several years, decisions regarding the border, taxes collected from the villages there, disputes settled without my direct involvement. At the time, I trusted his judgment completely. Now I wonder how many of those decisions served my kingdom, and how many served only him." "You could not have known," Lyra said. "Trust is not a weakness, my king. It becomes a weakness only when it is given to someone who does not deserve it, and even then, the fault lies with the one who broke that trust, not the one who gave it freely." Kaelin looked up at her across the fire, something unreadable moving behind his tired eyes. "You speak as though you understand betrayal well." "I understand what it means to be dismissed," Lyra said quietly. "My mother spent her whole life telling the truth to people who did not want to hear it, and she died believing no one had ever truly listened to her. I think, in some strange way, that is its own kind of betrayal, though a quieter one than what you now face." They sat in silence for a while after that, the fire crackling softly between them, and Lyra found herself studying the way the light played across his features, the tired lines around his eyes that softened slightly whenever he thought no one was watching him closely. She pushed the thought away quickly, reminding herself that whatever strange companionship had formed between them over the past several days was born from necessity, not anything deeper. The following morning, they resumed their journey toward the garrison, but Lyra noticed almost immediately that something felt different about the forest surrounding them. The birds that had filled the trees with sound the previous 2 mornings had fallen strangely silent, and Garrick's easy confidence from the days before had tightened into something more alert, more watchful. "Something is wrong," he murmured to Kaelin as they rode side by side along the narrow forest path. "The forest is too quiet." Kaelin's expression sharpened immediately, years of instinct rising to the surface beneath his composed exterior. "Stay close together," he said quietly to the rest of the group, "and stay alert." They had not traveled another half-mile before the path ahead of them collapsed without warning, a section of earth giving way beneath the lead rider's horse, sending both horse and rider tumbling into a hidden pit that had clearly been dug and carefully concealed with branches and leaves sometime before their arrival. The horse screamed, and chaos erupted through the small group as the remaining riders fought to control their startled mounts. "It is a trap," Garrick shouted, already dismounting to help the fallen rider, whose leg had been badly twisted in the fall, but who was otherwise, thankfully, still conscious and breathing. "Someone knew we would be traveling this path." Lyra's heart pounded as she looked around at the surrounding trees, the cold certainty in her stomach twisting violently, warning her that whatever had happened was no accident of nature. "This was meant for us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone knew exactly where we would be." Kaelin's face had gone pale with barely controlled anger, his eyes scanning the tree line as though searching for whoever might have set the trap and lingered nearby to witness its results. "Only a handful of people knew the route we would be taking," he said grimly. "And fewer still knew the true purpose of this journey." Before anyone could respond further, a sharp whistle cut through the tense silence of the forest, and Garrick's head snapped up, just in time to see movement among the trees ahead, shadows shifting between the trunks that did not belong to any animal Lyra recognized. "We are not alone," he called out, already reaching for the blade at his side. Protect the king. What followed happened faster than Lyra could fully process. A blur of shouting and movement, as several figures emerged from the concealment of the surrounding forest, wearing the plain, unmarked clothing of hired mercenaries, rather than any recognizable uniform. Garrick and the remaining guards moved quickly to form a protective barrier around Kaelin, but one of the attackers broke through the chaos, moving directly toward Lyra with clear and deliberate intent. She had never learned to defend herself, had never imagined a life where such a skill might become necessary, and for one terrifying moment, she simply froze, staring at the approaching figure with wide, panicked eyes. Then a strong hand caught her arm, pulling her sharply out of harm's way, and she found herself suddenly pressed close against Kaelin's side, his body positioned protectively between her and the advancing attacker. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice tight with controlled urgency, and before Lyra could fully register what was happening, he had moved to meet the attacker himself, his years of training as a warrior king, evident in the swift, controlled way he disarmed the man without allowing the encounter to escalate into something worse. The remaining attackers, seeing their ambush unraveling quickly against a group far more capable of defending itself than they had apparently anticipated, retreated back into the cover of the trees as swiftly as they had appeared, vanishing into the forest before Garrick and the others could pursue them. The clearing fell into a tense, breathless silence once they were gone, broken only by the labored breathing of the fallen rider and the soft, frightened whinnying of the horses. Lyra realized she was still trembling, her whole body flooded with the aftershock of fear, and it was only then that she noticed Kaelin's hand had remained on her arm the entire time, steady and warm, as though he had not once considered letting go. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "No," she managed. "You saved me." "I would not have forgiven myself if I had not reached you in time," he said quietly, and something in the way he said it carried far more weight than the simple words alone suggested. Garrick approached them a moment later, his expression grim as he surveyed the aftermath of the ambush. "This was no random attack," he said. "That pit was dug well before we arrived, and those men were waiting for us specifically. Someone provided them with our route in advance." "Draven," Kaelin said, the name leaving his mouth like something bitter. "He must have suspected more than I realized. Perhaps he followed us the morning we returned from the archive, or perhaps he has been watching more closely than I gave him credit for. If he tried to have us removed here, far from the palace, where it could easily be explained away as bandits or northern rebels," Lyra said slowly, "then he already believes we know enough to threaten him. He would not have taken such a risk otherwise." Kaelin's jaw tightened, and Lyra could see the fury simmering beneath his controlled exterior. Fury not only at the attempt on their lives, but at the deeper betrayal it represented, confirmation that the man he had trusted for years was now willing to see him harmed, rather than risk his own carefully constructed lies being exposed. "We continue to the garrison," he said finally, his voice hardening with resolve. "If anything, this only proves how much Draven has to hide, and how desperately he wishes to keep us from finding it. We will not turn back now." Garrick nodded, already moving to help the injured rider onto a spare horse, while the rest of the group began preparing to continue their journey, with far greater caution than before. Lyra remained close beside Kaelin as they resumed their path through the forest, the cold certainty in her stomach now joined by something new, a fierce and steady resolve that had not existed within her before the ambush. "Thank you," she said quietly, glancing up at him as they rode, "for protecting me. You have shown more courage over these past several days than most seasoned warriors I have known," Kaelin said, his eyes remaining fixed on the path ahead, though something in his voice had softened considerably. "Protecting you was the very least I could do in return." Lyra said nothing further, but as they continued deeper into the forest, drawing ever closer to the garrison and whatever truths waited to be uncovered there, she found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, in a way that had nothing to do with the danger they had just survived, and everything to do with the quiet, growing warmth that had begun to settle somewhere beneath the cold certainty she had carried since the moment she first spoke his treaties lie aloud. The garrison stationed along the border territories was smaller than Lyra had imagined, a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by a low stone wall, overlooking wide fields that stretched toward the disputed lands the treaty had been meant to settle. The soldiers stationed there greeted their king with the stiff formality of men unaccustomed to unannounced royal visits, and Lyra could sense an undercurrent of unease running through the garrison the moment they arrived, though she could not yet say what caused it. Kaelin spent the first day speaking with the garrison's commanding officers, asking careful questions about the treaty's enforcement, the administration of the surrounding villages, and the daily operations that had, according to the altered clause they had discovered, fallen entirely under Draven's authority, since the treaty's earliest provisions. Lyra observed quietly from the edges of these conversations, watching faces, listening for the cold twist in her stomach that would betray a lie. But the officers seemed to answer honestly enough, if somewhat nervously, clearly unsettled by their king's sudden and unexplained interest in matters they had assumed no one above them cared to question. It was on the second day, while walking along the edge of the garrison grounds near a quiet stretch of field, that Lyra first noticed the memorial. It stood alone at the edge of a small hill overlooking the border, a modest stone structure, engraved with dozens of names beneath a simple inscription, honoring fallen peacekeepers who had died protecting the treaty's earliest negotiations. She stopped in front of it, something cold and uneasy settling over her that had nothing to do with the crisp afternoon wind. "Kaelin," she called softly, and he crossed the field to join her, his expression curious, until he saw what had caught her attention. "I remember when this memorial was built," he said quietly, studying the rows of engraved names. "Draven proposed it himself, not long after the earliest phase of negotiations turned violent along the border. He said it was important to honor those who died protecting the peace process before it could truly begin." Lyra reached out and traced her fingers lightly over one of the engraved names, and the moment her skin touched the cold stone, the certainty in her stomach twisted so sharply that she gasped and pulled her hand back as though burned. "These names," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Something about this memorial is wrong." "What do you mean?" Kaelin asked, his brow furrowing with concern. "I do not know exactly," Lyra admitted, "but the feeling is stronger here than almost anywhere I have felt it before. Stronger even than when I first sensed the lie hidden within the treaty itself. Whatever this memorial claims to honor, it is not telling the truth." Kaelin turned to study the stone structure with new suspicion, his earlier grief over old losses shifting quickly into something more calculating. "Garrick," he called, and the captain approached quickly from where he had been overseeing the horses nearby. "Do you know the history of this memorial? Who exactly is buried here?" Garrick's expression grew troubled as he studied the stone marker. "I was stationed near the border during those early years, my king, though not directly involved in building this memorial. I remember hearing that the fallen were buried elsewhere, and that this stone was raised afterward simply to honor their names in a place easier for visiting officials to reach." "Buried elsewhere," Lyra repeated slowly. "Where?" Garrick hesitated, glancing between Lyra and his king with visible unease. "There were rumors, years ago, among the older soldiers stationed here, rumors of a burial site somewhere beyond the garrison's western boundary, closer to the disputed lands themselves. I never gave the stories much weight. Soldiers often speak of things they only half remember, especially regarding events from years past that no one wishes to discuss openly." "Take us there," Kaelin said, his voice firm with quiet resolve. The western boundary of the garrison lands led them through a stretch of overgrown forest that had clearly gone untended for years, the path barely visible beneath tangled roots and fallen branches. Garrick led the way with careful uncertainty, relying on half-remembered directions passed down from soldiers who had served long before him, until finally, they emerged into a small, hidden clearing that time and neglect had nearly swallowed entirely. Lyra felt the cold certainty in her stomach intensify the moment they stepped into the clearing, so overwhelming that she had to steady herself against a nearby tree to keep from stumbling. Beneath the overgrown grass and scattered leaves, she could make out the faint, unmistakable outlines of a burial ground, far larger than any modest memorial could account for. Dozens upon dozens of shallow graves, marked only with simple wooden stakes, most of which had rotted and fallen with the passing years. "This cannot be right," Kaelin said quietly, his voice heavy with disbelief as he moved slowly through the clearing, counting the faint outlines of graves that stretched further than any of them had initially realized. The memorial lists, perhaps 30 names. This is far more than 30 graves. Garrick knelt beside one of the few markers still legible enough to read, his expression grim as he studied the faded carving. "This name is not among those listed on the memorial," he said slowly. "I do not recognize it at all." They spent the remainder of the afternoon searching the hidden burial ground, and with each grave they examined, the same troubling pattern emerged. None of the names matched those honored on the polished memorial stone overlooking the garrison. Whoever these wolves had been, however they had died, their existence had been deliberately erased from official memory, buried both literally and in every record anyone might have thought to consult. "I think I understand now," Lyra said quietly, as the weight of what they had uncovered settled heavily over the clearing. "These are not peacekeepers who died protecting the treaty negotiations. These are wolves who died opposing them." Kaelin turned to look at her sharply. "Explain." "Think about it," Lyra said. "The altered clause we found removed the border villages' right to govern themselves, granting that authority instead to whoever enforced the treaty. If some of those villages resisted that change, if their leaders spoke out against losing their independence, and if Draven wished to ensure that resistance never grew strong enough to threaten his authority over the border territories." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought aloud, though the implication hung heavily in the silent clearing around them. "He would have needed to silence them," Kaelin finished quietly, his voice carrying a depth of horror and fury that Lyra had not heard from him before. "And then build a memorial, honoring imaginary peacekeepers, to ensure no one ever thought to ask what truly happened to the voices that opposed him." Garrick had gone pale, his hand tightening around the hilt of his blade, as though searching for something solid to hold on to, amid the horror of what they had discovered. "I served under Commander Draven for years, my king. I never once suspected he was capable of something like this." "None of us did," Kaelin said grimly. "That is precisely how he managed to hide it for so long." Lyra moved slowly through the clearing, studying the rows of forgotten graves with a heavy heart, thinking of the families who must have wondered for years what happened to loved ones who simply disappeared, never knowing the truth had been buried quite this literally, beneath overgrown grass and fallen leaves. "We need to give these wolves back their names," she said quietly. "Whatever else happens, they deserve to be remembered honestly, not erased to protect the man responsible for their deaths." "They will be," Kaelin promised, his voice hardening with renewed resolve. "I swear it. But first, we need enough proof to ensure Draven cannot simply explain this away, as he has explained away everything else. A hidden burial ground alone, without records connecting it directly to his actions, will not be enough to convict a commander as respected and as carefully protected as he has made himself." As the sun began to set behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the forgotten clearing, Lyra felt the full weight of what they had uncovered settling over her, heavier than anything she had imagined when she first felt the cold twist of certainty inside the ceremony hall days earlier. What had begun as a single-sensed lie had unraveled into something far darker and far more dangerous than a simple falsified treaty clause, a conspiracy built upon silence and forgotten graves, protected for years by a man everyone had trusted completely. "We are close to something much larger than either of us initially understood," she said softly, watching the last light fade from the sky above the hidden burial ground. "I fear we have only begun to uncover how deep this truly goes." Beside her, Kaelin said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the rows of forgotten graves stretching into the deepening shadows of the clearing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet, unshakable determination that left no room for doubt. "Then we will keep uncovering it," he said, "no matter how deep it runs, and no matter what it costs either of us, before the truth is finally brought into the light." They remained at the garrison for 3 more days, gathering what quiet evidence they could without drawing attention to their true purpose, and though the days were filled with careful investigation, the nights brought something Lyra had not expected to find, amid so much darkness and uncertainty. Each evening, once Garrick and the other soldiers had settled into their quarters, and the garrison had grown quiet beneath the stars, Kaelin would find her sitting alone, near the edge of the walls, and he would join her without a word, as though the habit had formed naturally between them, without either needing to name it. On the 3rd night, the sky above the border territories was unusually clear, thousands of stars scattered across the darkness, like scattered grains of salt, and Lyra found herself sitting beside Kaelin, on a low stone wall, overlooking the quiet fields, neither of them speaking for a long while, simply existing together in the comfortable silence that had grown between them over the past several days. "May I ask you something?" Kaelin said finally, breaking the quiet. "Of course. Your gift. Has it ever felt like a burden to you, rather than something useful?" Lyra considered the question carefully before answering, surprised by how genuinely curious he seemed, rather than simply polite. "Always," she admitted. "For most of my life, it brought me nothing but isolation. Children in my village used to whisper that I was cursed, that no one could hide anything from me, and so they avoided me entirely, rather than risk having their small lies exposed. My mother tried to teach me how to carry it quietly, how to keep the feeling to myself rather than speak it aloud, but even she could not fully protect me from how lonely it made my childhood. I am sorry," Kaelin said quietly, "that you carried something so difficult without anyone truly understanding it." "What about you?" Lyra asked, turning the question back toward him. "Being king so young, was that its own kind of burden?" Kaelin was quiet for a moment, staring out at the dark fields stretching toward the border. "My father died suddenly, an illness that took him within a matter of weeks, faster than anyone expected. I was barely more than a boy when the crown passed to me, and I remember feeling as though the entire kingdom was watching, waiting to see whether I would prove strong enough to hold what my father had built, or whether I would let it crumble beneath inexperience and grief." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "Draven was the first person who made me feel as though I could actually manage it. He guided me through those early years, with such confidence that I never thought to question whether his guidance always served the kingdom, or sometimes only served himself." "That is not a weakness in you," Lyra said gently, echoing the words she had offered him days earlier beside a different fire. "It is simply what happens when someone offers kindness to a grieving young man who desperately needed it, even if that kindness was not always as pure as it appeared." Kaelin turned to look at her then, something soft and searching in his expression that made her breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. "You have a way of understanding things most people overlook entirely," he said quietly. "Not only lies, but people themselves. I find myself grateful, more than I expected to be, that you chose to speak that day in the ceremony hall, even without proof to support you." "I nearly did not," Lyra admitted. "I stood there for what felt like an eternity, certain that speaking would only ruin my life, without changing anything at all. If you had not stopped the ceremony to listen, I do not know what might have happened, to me or to your kingdom." "I am glad I listened," Kaelin said simply, and something in the quiet sincerity of his voice settled warmly over her, chasing away some of the cold certainty that had lingered in her stomach since the hidden burial ground. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the stars slowly shifting overhead, until finally Lyra found herself speaking words she had not fully intended to say aloud. "I never imagined my life would lead me here," she said softly. "Sitting beside a king, uncovering conspiracies buried beneath forgotten graves. A few weeks ago, I was simply a woman, selling herbs in a small village market, invisible to almost everyone around me." "You are not invisible," Kaelin said, his voice low and certain. "I do not think you could be invisible if you tried." Something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in Lyra's chest at his words, and when she glanced up to find him watching her with an expression far softer than any king should reasonably wear, she felt the careful distance she had maintained between them since the ceremony hall begin to quietly dissolve. "Kaelin," she began, unsure exactly what she meant to say. "I know," he said gently, before she could find the words herself. "This is complicated. I am a king in the middle of uncovering a betrayal that threatens everything I have built, and you are the woman whose courage made that uncovering possible. Whatever exists between us now deserves more careful consideration than either of us can afford to give it while Draven remains a danger to us both." "That is not what I was going to say," Lyra admitted quietly, though she could not deny the truth in his words. "But you are right. There will be time for this, later, once the truth is fully uncovered, and we are both safe enough to consider what it might mean." Kaelin reached out then, gently taking her hand in his, and though the gesture was simple, it carried a weight far greater than words could have expressed. "I intend to hold you to that," he said softly, "once all of this is finally behind us." They remained there together, beneath the stars for a while longer, hands intertwined, the quiet warmth between them, a small, steady comfort against the darkness of everything they had uncovered, and everything still waiting to be revealed. For the first time since she had spoken that single, terrifying word in the ceremony hall days earlier, Lyra allowed herself to feel something other than fear and cold certainty, a fragile, growing hope that whatever waited for them at the end of this dangerous path, she would not have to face it entirely alone. The following morning brought news that shattered the fragile peace of the previous night entirely. Garrick arrived at their quarters before dawn, his expression grim and urgent, a folded letter clutched tightly in his hand. "My king," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "A rider arrived overnight from the palace. Commander Draven has called an emergency session of the full Pack Council, citing concerns over the king's prolonged and unexplained absence from court. The council convenes in 3 days." Kaelin's expression hardened instantly, the softness of the previous night replaced by the sharp, calculating focus of a king facing a direct political threat. "He is moving against us," he said grimly. "He knows we suspect him, and he intends to strike before we can gather enough proof to expose him fully." "What do we do?" Lyra asked, her heart pounding with sudden urgency. "We return to the palace immediately," Kaelin said, already moving to gather his belongings with swift, decisive purpose. "If Draven intends to challenge my authority before the council, I will not give him the advantage of facing that challenge from a distance. Whatever proof we have gathered, however incomplete it remains, we will need to be ready to use it far sooner than either of us anticipated." Lyra rose quickly to help prepare for their sudden departure, the warmth of the previous night's quiet conversation giving way once more to the cold, familiar certainty that had guided her since the very beginning of this dangerous journey. Whatever peace they had found together beneath the stars would have to wait, she realized, until the far more dangerous confrontation now rushing toward them had finally been faced and survived. The council chamber was already filled to capacity by the time Kaelin and Lyra arrived back at the palace. 3 days of hard travel etched into their tired faces, though neither had allowed exhaustion to slow their pace once they understood what waited for them. The Pack Council, a body of elders and regional representatives who advised the throne on matters too significant for the king to decide alone, sat arranged in a wide semicircle facing the raised platform, where Kaelin would need to answer for his unexplained absence. Draven stood near the front of the chamber, composed and confident, and the moment his eyes found Kaelin entering the room, Lyra saw something flicker across his face, surprise perhaps, or the careful recalculation of a man who had expected more time before his opponent returned to challenge him directly. "My king," Draven said smoothly, inclining his head with practiced respect as Kaelin took his place at the front of the chamber. "I am relieved to see you return safely. The council grew concerned when your absence extended so much longer than expected, particularly given the unresolved matter of the treaty." "I was conducting an investigation," Kaelin said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber, steady and controlled, despite the tension Lyra could sense radiating beneath his composed exterior. "One I believe this council deserves to hear about in full." An elderly council member near the front, a stern-looking wolf named Felix who Lyra vaguely recognized from stories of his decades of service to the throne, leaned forward with visible skepticism. "With respect, my king, the council was under the impression this investigation concerned nothing more than the unproven claims of a stranger who disrupted a ceremony 50 years in the making. Surely such claims do not warrant the extended absence of the throne itself, nor the continued delay of a treaty our people desperately need." "The claims were far from unproven," Kaelin said. "I have discovered evidence of significant falsification within the treaty's terms, evidence that suggests Commander Draven altered the agreement's original provisions without the knowledge or consent of the northern delegation, granting himself administrative authority over the border territories that was never intended by either side." A wave of shocked murmuring swept through the council chamber, and Lyra watched Draven's expression carefully, searching for any crack in his composure. To his credit, he betrayed almost nothing, his face arranging itself into an expression of wounded confusion, so convincing that had Lyra not already known the truth, she might almost have believed it herself. "My king, these are serious accusations," Draven said, his voice carrying the wounded dignity of a man falsely accused. "I have served this throne faithfully since your father's reign. I would ask the council to consider carefully before accepting such claims without concrete proof, particularly given their source." His eyes flicked briefly toward Lyra, standing quietly near the edge of the chamber. I understand a woman with unproven claims of some mystical gift has been advising the king throughout this investigation. Is this council truly meant to weigh serious accusations against a decorated commander, based on the word of a stranger, and her unverifiable instincts? Several council members exchanged uncertain glances, and Lyra felt the familiar sting of dismissal creeping through the chamber. The same skepticism she had faced her entire life, whenever she tried to speak an uncomfortable truth to people who preferred comfortable lies. But this time, unlike every time before, she was not standing alone. I did not rely solely on Lyra's instincts, Kaelin said firmly, cutting through the growing murmur of doubt. I have physical evidence. An original draft of the treaty, recovered from the palace's lower archive, containing the unaltered clause protecting the border village's right to self-governance, a clause that mysteriously disappeared from the final signed agreement without any record of formal renegotiation. He produced the scroll they had recovered days earlier, unrolling it carefully before the assembled council, and the murmuring in the chamber shifted immediately, curiosity and concern replacing outright skepticism, as several council members leaned forward to study the document more closely. This proves nothing, Draven said quickly, though Lyra noticed a slight edge creeping into his otherwise composed voice. Drafts are revised constantly throughout negotiations. The absence of a formal record simply reflects the informal nature of many discussions held during those years. Perhaps, Kaelin said. Except we also discovered something else during our investigation. A burial ground, hidden along the western boundary of the border garrison, containing dozens of graves belonging to wolves, whose names appear nowhere in official records. Wolves who do not match any of the names honored on the memorial you yourself proposed be built to commemorate the treaty's fallen peacekeepers. The chamber fell utterly silent at this, the weight of the accusation settling heavily over every wolf present. Even Felix, who had spoken so skeptically only moments before, now sat forward with visible unease, his sharp eyes fixed intently on Draven's face. For the first time since the confrontation began, Lyra saw something crack in Draven's carefully maintained composure, a flicker of genuine alarm passing behind his eyes before he quickly smoothed it away. I do not know what my king believes he found, he said carefully, but I assure this council, whatever exists in that clearing has nothing to do with me. Then you will not object to a formal investigation, Kaelin said, his voice hardening. One conducted openly, by council-appointed representatives, examining both the burial ground and the full history of the treaty's negotiations, including every decision made under the authority you granted yourself through that altered clause. A murmur of agreement rippled through the council chamber, several members nodding in support of Kaelin's proposal, and Lyra felt a small flicker of hope rise within her, the first real sense that the truth might actually be recognized and acted upon by those with the power to demand accountability. But then a council member near the back of the chamber rose to speak, a stern-faced wolf Lyra did not recognize, his voice carrying an authority that immediately drew every eye in the room. Before this council agrees to any formal investigation, he said, I believe we must first address a more immediate concern. The woman standing beside the king, her unproven claims began this entire disruption, and I am not alone in questioning whether someone with such unverified abilities should be permitted to influence decisions of this magnitude. I move that the council vote to formally revoke any protection currently extended to this woman by the throne, he continued, and that she be removed from the palace and the ongoing investigation entirely, pending a separate inquiry into the legitimacy of her claimed gift. Lyra felt her stomach drop, the cold certainty she had carried for weeks, now joined by a very different, far more personal fear. Around the chamber, several council members nodded slowly in support of the motion, and she realized with sudden clarity that despite everything Kaelin had uncovered, despite the mounting evidence against Draven, there were still those within this room who found it easier to distrust the messenger than confront the uncomfortable truth she carried. Kaelin stepped forward immediately, his voice cutting through the chamber with unmistakable authority. I will not allow this council to punish the very person whose courage uncovered a betrayal threatening our entire kingdom, he said. Lyra Ashworth risked everything, her safety, her reputation, her life, to bring forward a truth she could have easily kept silent. If this council chooses to vote against her now, it votes against the very transparency and honesty this treaty was always meant to represent. "My king," Felix said slowly, rising once more from his seat, his earlier skepticism now tempered by something more thoughtful. "I confess, I remain uncertain about the nature of this young woman's gift. But I have served on this council long enough to recognize genuine evidence when it is presented before me, and the scroll you have shown us, along with the disturbing discovery of an unmarked burial ground, cannot simply be dismissed because we are uncomfortable with how the investigation began. I move instead that the council proceed with a formal investigation into Commander Draven's conduct, and that Lyra Ashworth remain under the throne's protection until that investigation concludes." A tense silence followed his words, the chamber divided visibly between those swayed by Felix's measured reasoning and those still clinging to the comfortable dismissal Draven's supporters preferred. Kalen stood firm at the front of the chamber, his gaze sweeping slowly across every council member present, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the full weight of his authority as king. "I did not ask this council's permission to investigate the truth," he said. "I informed you of it, out of respect for this body's role in advising the throne. But make no mistake, this investigation will continue, with or without this council's formal endorsement. The only question before you now is whether you wish to stand alongside your king in seeking justice for wolves who were silenced and buried without honor, or whether you wish to be remembered as the council that chose comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth." The silence that followed felt as though it stretched for an eternity, every wolf in the chamber weighing the full weight of the choice now placed before them. Finally, one by one, council members began to nod, until finally even the stern-faced wolf who had first moved against Lyra reluctantly lowered his gaze in quiet concession. "The council will support a formal investigation," Felix announced, his voice carrying the chamber's collective decision, "and the woman will remain under the throne's protection until that investigation concludes." Draven's composed mask had finally begun to crack entirely, something cold and calculating visible now behind his eyes, as he realized the tide within the chamber had turned decisively against him. When he spoke again, his voice had lost much of its earlier smoothness, replaced instead by something sharper, more dangerous. "Very well," he said quietly. "Let the investigation proceed. I have nothing to fear from the truth." But as his eyes met Lyra's across the crowded chamber, the cold certainty in her stomach twisted violently, warning her, with absolute clarity, that Draven Cole was already planning something far more dangerous than a formal investigation could ever hope to contain. The formal investigation moved quickly once the council granted its approval. A team of appointed representatives dispatched to the border territories to examine the hidden burial ground while palace scribes combed through years of archived records, searching for further evidence of Draven's altered authority. Lyra remained close to Kalen throughout those tense days, both of them aware that Draven, though outwardly cooperative, was watching every development with the careful calculation of a man searching for his next move. It was Garrick who first brought word of the breakthrough, arriving at Kalen's study late one evening, with a wolf Lyra did not recognize, trailing nervously behind him, a thin, anxious-looking man whose eyes darted constantly toward the door, as though he expected to be pursued at any moment. "My king," Garrick said, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately drew Kalen's full attention. "This is Owen. He served under Commander Draven for many years, stationed at the border garrison during the earliest phase of the treaty negotiations. He came to me tonight, insisting he needed to speak with you directly." Owen shifted uncomfortably beneath the weight of the king's attention, his hands twisting together in visible distress. "My king, I have carried this for years," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I did not know how to speak of it, who I could trust to hear it, without punishing me simply for having witnessed what I witnessed. But when word reached the garrison of the burial ground being investigated, I knew I could remain silent no longer." "Sit," Kalen said gently, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. "Tell us everything." Owen lowered himself slowly into the offered seat, and Lyra watched him carefully, feeling for the familiar cold twist that would betray a lie, but instead, she felt only the raw, unmistakable weight of genuine fear and long-buried guilt. Whatever Owen had come to confess, he believed every word of it completely. "I was a young soldier then, barely more than a boy myself," he began, "assigned to the garrison during the second year of negotiations. not long after Commander Draven took over the treaty process from the earlier delegation. There was a village, not far from the border, whose leaders opposed the change in terms that would strip their people of the right to govern themselves. They sent representatives to the garrison, demanding to speak with Commander Draven directly, insisting the northern delegation would never have agreed to such a change without proper negotiation. He paused, his hands trembling visibly now, and Lyra could see the weight of the memory pressing down on him, years of carried silence finally breaking free. Commander Draven met with them privately, he continued. I was stationed as a guard outside the meeting, close enough to hear voices raised, though I could not make out the words clearly. When the meeting ended, the village representatives did not leave the garrison as they had arrived. I never saw them again after that night. What happened to them? Kalen asked quietly, though his expression suggested he already suspected the terrible answer. I do not know for certain, Owen admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I was young and afraid, and I told myself perhaps they had simply been escorted elsewhere, perhaps detained rather than harmed. I did not allow myself to consider the alternative, not truly, not for a long time. But in the weeks that followed, other village leaders who had voiced similar objections along the border began disappearing as well, always quietly, always explained away as bandits or unfortunate accidents along dangerous roads. And then the memorial was built, honoring names I had never heard before, names that did not belong to any soldiers I recognized as having served or died during that time. Lyra felt sick with the confirmation of everything they had already suspected, the pieces finally settling into a complete and horrifying picture. You believe Commander Draven ordered those village leaders silenced, she said quietly, and then built a memorial specifically to disguise what had truly happened to them. I believe it now, with a certainty I could not allow myself years ago, Owen said, tears gathering in his eyes. I have carried the guilt of my silence for years, my king. I told myself I had no proof, that speaking out would only cost me my life, without changing anything at all. But when I heard the burial ground had finally been found, I understood I could no longer live with the shame of having said nothing, while an innocent woman risked everything to bring this truth into the light. Kalen reached out and placed a steady hand on Owen's shoulder. Your courage in coming forward now matters greatly, he said gently. Would you be willing to testify before the full council, to speak this same truth openly, where it can be formally recorded as part of the investigation? Owen hesitated, visible fear warring with the relief of having finally unburdened himself of a secret he had carried too long alone. I am afraid of what Commander Draven might do, my king, if he learns I have spoken against him. You will be protected, Kalen promised firmly. I give you my word as king. Whatever courage it takes to speak this truth publicly, I will ensure it does not cost you your safety. After a long moment, Owen nodded slowly, wiping the tears from his eyes with the back of his trembling hand. Then I will testify, he said quietly. For the village leaders who never received justice, and for every year I remained silent when I should have spoken. Once Owen had been escorted to secure quarters within the palace, guarded closely by soldiers Kalen trusted completely. Lyra found herself standing alone with Kalen once more, in the quiet study, the weight of Owen's confession settling heavily between them. This changes everything, Kalen said quietly. A living witness, willing to testify openly before the council. Combined with the physical evidence we already possess, Draven will have no way to explain this away, as misunderstanding or coincidence. He will not accept this quietly, Lyra warned. Not after everything he has done to protect this secret for so many years. If he believes Owen's testimony will truly expose him beyond any possibility of denial, I fear what he might attempt to prevent it. Kalen's expression darkened with the same concern already forming in Lyra's own mind. Then we ensure Owen remains protected at all times, until he has spoken before the council, he said, and we move the formal hearing as quickly as possible, before Draven has time to devise some way of silencing him, as he silenced those village leaders years ago. The council hearing was scheduled for 3 days later, and throughout that tense waiting period, Lyra felt the cold certainty in her stomach growing steadily sharper, an unmistakable warning that Draven had not yet exhausted his willingness to protect the lies he had built his power upon. She said as much to Kalen each evening, as they reviewed the evidence together, preparing carefully for what would surely become the most decisive confrontation yet in their long struggle to expose the truth. Whatever happens, Kalen said quietly, on the final evening before the hearing, as they sat together once more near the fire in his private study. I want you to know that none of this would have been possible without you. Your courage in that ceremony hall, speaking a truth you could not yet prove, began everything that has followed. Whatever justice we managed to secure for those forgotten graves, it belongs as much to you as to anyone else who fought for it. Lyra felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion at his words. Years of feeling dismissed and unheard, finally giving way to something that felt, for the first time in her life, like genuine recognition. Thank you, she whispered, for believing me, when you had every reason not to. Kalen reached across the small space between them, and gently took her hand, his eyes holding hers, with a warmth that had nothing to do with the danger still surrounding them. I believe in you, he said softly, in more ways than simply trusting your gift for sensing lies. Whatever comes tomorrow, and whatever comes after, I intend to see this through beside you, for as long as you will allow me to. The quiet promise settled warmly between them, a small, steady comfort against the uncertainty of what tomorrow's hearing would bring, and though the cold certainty in Lyra's stomach had not fully faded, warning her still of the danger Draven represented, she found herself facing that danger now, with something she had never possessed before meeting Kalen Voss. Hope, steady and unwavering, that whatever darkness remained to be uncovered, they would face it together, and they would not be facing it alone. The council chamber was more crowded than it had been for the earlier session, word of the pending testimony having spread quietly through the palace over the preceding days, despite everyone's careful efforts at discretion. Lyra stood near the front of the chamber beside Kalen, watching as council members filed into their seats, and she could feel the tension radiating through the room like heat from a fire, every wolf present sensing that whatever unfolded today would fundamentally reshape the kingdom's understanding of its own recent history. Draven arrived last, entering the chamber with the same composed confidence he had worn throughout every prior confrontation, though Lyra noticed something different in his posture today, a tightness in his shoulders that suggested even his carefully maintained calm was beginning to strain under the mounting weight of evidence against him. My king, he said, inclining his head, as he took his position near the front of the chamber. I understand today's session concerns further developments in this ongoing investigation. I remain, as always, prepared to answer whatever questions this council deems necessary. Today we will hear testimony, Kalen said, from a witness with direct knowledge of events surrounding the disappearance of village leaders who opposed the treaty's altered terms. A murmur rippled through the assembled council, and Lyra watched Draven's expression carefully, as Owen was escorted into the chamber, flanked by guards Kalen trusted completely. For just a moment, something flickered across Draven's face, quick and sharp, before he smoothed it away once more behind practiced composure. But Lyra had seen it, and she knew, with the same absolute certainty that had guided her from the very beginning, that Draven recognized the danger Owen's presence represented. Owen's testimony, though delivered with visible nervousness, was clear and unwavering, every detail matching precisely what he had confessed privately days earlier. As he spoke of the village representatives who had entered the garrison and never left, of the pattern of disappearances that followed, and of the memorial built specifically to disguise the truth of what had happened, the chamber grew increasingly silent, the weight of his words settling heavily over every wolf present. This is a fabrication, Draven said, once Owen finished speaking, though his voice carried less of its earlier smoothness than before. A frightened soldier, misremembering events from years ago, perhaps coerced or influenced by those determined to see me removed from my position, regardless of the truth. I have no reason to lie, Owen said, his voice trembling but resolute. I have carried this guilt for years, Commander. I am not here to see you punished unjustly. I am here because innocent wolves deserve to have the truth of their deaths finally acknowledged, rather than buried beneath false names on a stone memorial. Felix rose slowly from his seat, his sharp eyes fixed intently on Draven's increasingly strained expression. Commander Cole, he said, this council has now heard direct testimony, corroborating physical evidence of an altered treaty, an unmarked burial ground, containing names absent from any official record, and a witness account describing the disappearance of individuals who directly opposed your authority over the border territories. I would ask you, directly and plainly, to explain these findings to the satisfaction of this council. For a long moment, Draven said nothing, his eyes moving slowly across the chamber, taking in the expressions of council members who had once trusted him without question, now watching him instead with dawning suspicion and horror. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost entirely the smooth confidence that had carried him through every prior confrontation. "Everything I did," he said quietly, "I did to protect this kingdom's stability." The border villages could not be allowed to fracture the treaty's authority with 50 separate voices, each pursuing its own interests rather than unified peace. "I made difficult decisions, decisions no one else was willing to make, to ensure this kingdom's future remained secure." "You murdered wolves who opposed you," Kalen said, his voice cutting through the chamber with cold, unmistakable fury. "And then you buried the truth of what you had done, beneath false names and empty ceremony, deceiving your king, this council, and every family who never learned what truly happened to their missing loved ones. That is not protecting this kingdom's stability, Draven. That is betraying everything this kingdom is meant to stand for." Something shifted then in Draven's expression, the last remnants of his careful composure finally crumbling entirely into something far more desperate and dangerous. "You do not understand the pressures I faced," he said, his voice rising with barely controlled panic. "You were young, untested, and I alone bore the weight of ensuring this treaty succeeded, where 50 years of failed negotiations had come before. Everything I built to secure a peace this kingdom desperately needed." "Then let this council judge whether the peace you built was worth its cost," Kalen said firmly. "Guards, take Commander Cole into custody, pending formal judgment by this council for crimes against the wolves he was sworn to protect." For a terrible moment, Lyra feared Draven might attempt something desperate, and she saw his eyes dart briefly toward the chamber doors, as though calculating some final, reckless escape. But before he could act on whatever desperate thought crossed his mind, several guards moved swiftly to surround him, and Garrick stepped forward personally to ensure the arrest proceeded without incident. "You will regret this," Draven said quietly, his voice low and cold as guards secured his arms, his eyes fixed not on Kalen, but on Lyra, standing quietly beside him. "All of this, unraveled because of a stranger's unproven feelings. I hope, little seer, that you understand exactly what you have cost this kingdom, by refusing to simply let a peaceful lie stand undisturbed. A peace built on silenced voices and forgotten graves was never truly peace at all," Lyra said, holding his gaze steadily, despite the lingering fear his words stirred within her. "I would rather see this kingdom face a difficult truth than continue building its future on a lie that would only have grown heavier with each year it remained buried." Draven said nothing further as the guards led him from the chamber, his earlier composure entirely gone, replaced by something bitter and hollow that Lyra suspected would haunt her memory for a long time afterward. The council chamber remained silent for a long moment after he had been removed, every wolf present processing the full weight of what they had just witnessed, a trusted commander's carefully constructed deception, finally and completely unraveled before their eyes. Felix rose once more, his weathered face carrying the heavy solemnity of a man who had served long enough to understand the significance of the moment. "This council formally recognizes the findings of this investigation," he said, "and commits to a full and public accounting of the wolves whose deaths were concealed beneath Commander Cole's altered treaty and false memorial. Their names will be restored to honest record, and their families will be informed of the truth, however difficult that truth may be to bear." A murmur of solemn agreement moved through the chamber, and Lyra felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, relief and grief mingling together, as the weight of weeks of danger and uncertainty finally began to lift. Beside her, Kalen reached out and gently took her hand, and though neither of them spoke, the quiet gesture carried everything words might have failed to fully express. Later, once the council chamber had emptied, and the immediate chaos of Draven's arrest had settled into the quieter work of formal proceedings, Kalen found Lyra standing alone near the palace gardens, watching the last light of evening fade slowly across the sky. "It is over," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "Not entirely," Lyra said. "There is still much work ahead, a new treaty to write, honestly this time, and families who deserve to finally learn the truth about what happened to those they lost." "That work will continue," Kalen agreed, "but the danger that has followed us since that ceremony hall has finally ended. Draven can no longer threaten either of us, or anyone else who dares to speak an inconvenient truth." Lyra turned to look at him then, the weight of everything they had endured together, finally settling into something that felt, for the first time in weeks, like genuine relief. I never imagined, when I spoke that single word in the ceremony hall, that it would lead me here, she said quietly. Nor did I imagine, Kaelin said, reaching up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, that the woman who disrupted the most important ceremony of my reign would become someone I could not imagine facing the future without. His voice softened further, something tender and unmistakably sincere shining in his tired eyes. Whatever comes next for this kingdom, Lyra Ashworth, I find myself hoping you might consider remaining close to see it through beside me, not simply as an advisor whose gift proved invaluable, but as someone whose presence I have come to treasure far beyond what either of us anticipated when this all began. Lyra felt her heart swell, with an emotion she had spent her whole life believing she would never truly experience. The quiet, steady warmth of being genuinely seen and valued, not despite the strange gift that had isolated her for so long, but because of the courage that gift had ultimately required of her. I would like that very much, she said softly, and when Kaelin smiled at her words, truly smiled, for perhaps the first time since she had met him, she felt certain, with the same unwavering conviction that had guided her from the very beginning, that whatever future awaited them, it would be built this time on nothing but honest ground. 3 months passed before the new treaty was finally ready for signing. 3 months of careful, honest negotiation that Kaelin insisted be conducted openly, with representatives from every border village given a genuine voice in shaping the terms that would govern their future. Lyra remained at his side throughout the process, no longer simply a stranger whose accusation had disrupted a ceremony, but a trusted advisor whose gift for sensing dishonesty ensured that every clause negotiated this time would hold the weight of genuine truth rather than carefully hidden deception. The northern delegation, once wary and impatient after the earlier scandal, grew increasingly respectful as the new negotiations unfolded, recognizing in Kaelin's transparent approach a genuine commitment to lasting peace rather than the hollow appearance of it. Nora, the retired scribe whose memory had first pointed them toward the truth, was invited to oversee the official documentation of the new treaty's proceedings, ensuring nothing would ever again be quietly altered or erased from the historical record. The forgotten burial ground along the western boundary of the border garrison had been transformed as well, the overgrown clearing carefully cleared and honored with proper markers bearing the true names of every wolf who had died there, their families finally informed of what had truly happened to their missing loved ones. It was a painful reckoning for many, grief long delayed finally allowed to surface after years of uncertainty, but Lyra had watched, standing quietly beside Kaelin during the memorial ceremony, as something like peace settled slowly over families who had waited far too long for honest answers. Draven Cole's formal judgment had been rendered by the full council weeks earlier, his crimes against the border villages and his deception of the throne resulting in permanent removal from any position of authority and lasting exile from the kingdom's borders. Some among the council had argued for harsher punishment, but Kaelin had insisted, quietly and firmly, that the new era of his reign would not begin with vengeance, but with the same commitment to honest justice that had guided the entire investigation from its very beginning. On the morning of the new treaty's signing, the ceremony hall filled once more with hundreds of wolves from both the northern and southern packs, alongside representatives from every border village, whose voices had finally been restored to the negotiations that would shape their future. Lyra stood near the front of the hall this time, not hidden among the crowd as she had been months earlier, but standing openly beside the throne, her place beside the king now acknowledged and respected by everyone present. Kaelin lifted the ceremonial pen once more, and this time, when he pressed it to the parchment, Lyra felt nothing but warm, steady certainty settle over her, the absence of that familiar cold twist, confirming everything she needed to know about the honesty of the words being signed into permanent record. The hall erupted into applause as the treaty was finally sealed, 50 years of conflict formally and honestly resolved, the peace this time built upon a foundation strong enough to last. Afterward, as the celebration spilled out into the palace courtyards, Kaelin found Lyra standing quietly near the edge of the gathering, watching the joyful chaos of wolves from both packs, mingling together, for the first time in generations, without the shadow of hidden deception hanging over their newfound peace. "You did this," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. Whatever credit history assigns to me for signing this treaty, the truth is that none of it would exist without your courage, that day in the ceremony hall. We did this, Lyra corrected gently. Together. You could have easily dismissed me that day, my king. Many in your position would have. Instead, you listened, even without proof, and that choice changed everything that followed. Kaelin smiled, reaching out to take her hand as they stood together, watching the celebration unfold around them. I intend to keep listening, he said quietly, for as long as you are willing to remain beside me, to speak the truths this kingdom needs to hear. I intend to remain exactly that long, Lyra said softly, and when Kaelin leaned down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead, she felt the last remnants of the isolation that had defined her entire life finally dissolve completely, replaced by the warm, steady certainty of having finally found a place, and a person, where her strange and lonely gift was no longer a burden to be hidden, but a strength to be honored. Years later, historians would write of the treaty that finally ended the Great War between the Northern and Southern Pacts, crediting King Kaelin Voss with the wisdom to seek truth over convenient peace, and Queen Lyra Voss with the courage to speak that truth aloud, when silence would have been so much easier. The forgotten graves along the border, once hidden beneath false names and empty ceremony, would be remembered instead as a solemn reminder of what could happen when power went unquestioned for too long, and the treaty they inspired would stand for generations as proof that even the deepest buried lies could not withstand a truth spoken by someone brave enough to never once doubt what she knew, in her heart, to be genuinely real.